On the 2nd of April 2025 in the year of our Lord Talos, I put out an hour and 15-ish minute video where I read through all the current editions of Mage the Ascension, which are, as of the recording of this, the 5th of April 2025, 1st, 2nd, revised or 3rd edition, and 4th edition, which is 20th anniversary edition of Mage the Ascension. Why have I done this? Well, if you've been following Lore by Night for some time, you would know that I have not been the biggest admirer of Mage the Ascension, and I had a bit of a redemption arc, as you would. And you can go and watch that video for all the details regarding that, then come back to this one, because we're going to be carrying on with the experiment where I left off in the previous episode video of this experiment series thing, and I don't know what I'm doing with my hands, but we are going to be reading these books, which are all pretty chunky things, also really fucking expensive as well, but we'll get on to the money side of things later on. But what are those books? Well, so these 5 books came as 2 different parts. The first 3 I ordered as one lot, but they arrived on 2 separate days, and then the other 2 arrived, well, yesterday, actually, the 4th of April 2025, in the year of our Lord Talos, but I ordered them about a week or so after receiving the 3rd batch. That was one of those purchases when I bought when I was really sad and I wanted to accelerate the process of getting this experiment done and started, because we need to start things in order to finish them. Wowzers. So let's have a look at the first batch of 3. So the first 2 that came together are The Guide to the Technocracy, and apologies for the whole camera lighting thing, there's only so much I can do here. And alongside that we have Mage Storytellers Handbook, which was released with revised, and The Guide to the Technocracy was released for 2nd, but of course you can use these for any editions of Mage. These came on the 25th of March 2025 in the year of our Lord Talos, and the one that came the next day on the 26th of March 2025 in the year of our Lord Talos is the Book of Madness, which I'm having to be really careful about how I show this one because of where my fingers are. So let's just go back a little bit and talk a little bit about the Guide to the Technocracy if you don't know or you need a bit of a reminder. So the Guide to the Technocracy is, as the book would say, the Guide to the Technocracy, the more science, reason and logic based faction of mages that supposedly have everything wrapped around their fingers. But if you think about it, they are only able to do what they do because of the sleepers, the mortals. I mentioned a lot in the previous part of this experiment, or experiment part 1, however you want to word it, that I really liked the concept of the Technocracy and I really wanted to learn more. And several people, as I was logging bits of this on my Blue Sky page, and to an extent the YouTube community post, which you should definitely check out because they're totally based, recommending me that I pick this book up. And about 6 of you got me PDFs of this book, and only one of them was a legitimate copy, i.e. you purchased it for me, and that was Ian Watson. And let's have a look at the back of the book now. Ian Watson, friend of the channel, was very helpful in the previous part of this video, as they are the resident mage nut. Also, Ian also has the added bonus of being a White Wolf / World of Darkness developer, who has contributed to quite a few World of Darkness books. The main one in relation to Mage is M20 Victorian Mage, which is pretty cool. And they also got me the PDF for that one, Sorcerer's Crusade and Dark Ages Mage. There might have been another one in that mix. There probably is, because Ian was very generous with their gifts, as it were, and also, as I said, they were very helpful in the previous episode thing, answering all my different questions, and I'm sure they're going to be getting a lot more in this one. So yeah, Ian knows their stuff, and Ian also recommended the Storyteller's Handbook, which is going to be the last book that I'm going to be reading, and the Guide to the Technocracy is going to be the first, but we'll go through the whole order of things in a moment. But this is obviously the main ST book for revised edition of Mage, and you can tell that by the brownish colour scheme and how Mage is how is written with the whole pattern and font face. So hopefully I'll be able to get some cool ideas with that once I have collected the other bits of my knowledge. Now, one of the other things I wanted to learn, well, 2 of the things actually I should say, are learning about the Nethandic mages and the Marauders, which are chaos and entropy respectively, and we're going to learn more about that probably, hopefully, as I go through this particular book. And the Book of Madness, I've heard people saying is like the best book for talking about the Marauders, but it also has information talking about them in the Fandy, and this is what it looks like on the back. That was really awkward to do, covering that woman's nipple. So hopefully we'll be able to find out some information with this book about these different types of mages. Now, I also mentioned that I wanted to get my hands on M20's Book of the Fallen, which wasn't originally going to be part of that experiment, or at least not as quickly as I initially had thought, but I was able to get my hands on through Drive Through RPG, the Book of the Fallen, which alongside another book that I'll talk about arrived yesterday. And this is like the main book on the Nefandi, you can even see here. We've got some beautiful artwork by Samuel Aria. Like, when I saw this, I want to say 2020, 21-ish, like, I was just sort of blown back by this, like, that's so fucking cool. And this is what it looks like on the back. It's a similar sort of font art and the font, and this actually has like a proper content warning for like mature audiences, because of course World of Darkness has been mature audience, blah blah blah, but this goes some extra steps to be quite the horrifying title. And I do want to say, I'm going to leave all these books that I'm mentioning and more possibly in the description below, but I believe unless you actually go into your settings and change it to view adult only or mature things, you won't be able to see this, I think. I don't know, but just go into your like account settings and make sure that that's turned off so you can see that, potentially. And also, if you purchase those specific books with those specific links, I get the money back because I'm a film from Drive Through RPG, and I can carry on spending hundreds of pounds, literally hundreds of British pounds, providing cool little videos like this, because this is not a cheap endeavour. This is not a cheap endeavour. It's a lot of money, and any help would be greatly appreciated. Now, let's talk about that fifth book, because this fifth book was not mentioned at all in the previous part of this experiment, and that is M20's Technocracy Reloaded, which is essentially the M20's update to the Technocracy. Now, I've heard this is either really good or really bad, and I like Marmite experiences with video games, films, and books, so we're going to learn a bit more about the Technocracy in the 20th Anniversary Edition setting, which is also useful just to update things a little bit, and just so I can see what I like, what I don't like, so when I'm running them in future Mage games, hopefully that's going to be plural, we'll be able to learn lots about that. And rather than having just the White Wolf and Onyx Path, you've got the World of Darkness logo on the back there, which I find a little jarring. So yeah, that's all the parts to this experiment. So whereas the last one we had 4 books to deal with, we're now dealing with 5. Wowzers, a whole extra book. And I think altogether they are just slightly over M20. I jest. Only barely. So what order am I going to be reading all of these? Well, if I just grab each book and just shuffle them into place. I've already mentioned that I'm going to be reading Guide to the Technocracy first, and I'm going to be reading the Mage Storyteller's Handbook last. But how I showed them off earlier on is how I'm going to be reading them again. Fucking paradox, fiddling with my camera. I'm going to be reading the Technocracy ones first, then the Book of the Madness, then the Book of the Fallen, and then the ST's guide, just to round everything off. And if I show a bit more interest in the traditions, I might go out of my way and purchase guides for the traditions, and then do a separate thing on that altogether, which would be a very interesting thing indeed, potentially. Who knows? So yeah, those are the 5 books that I'm going to be reading for this. Again, I'm going to be cataloguing my overall experiences reading that book for the first time, so don't expect like a deep dive review sort of thing like you would find with my other book reviews. So similar to the Mage thing previously. So again, go and check that video out to work out the similar format. I'll tell you about what I do and don't like, and any other bits of inspiration that just comes along the way, and of other thoughts and opinions and all that fucking wank. So without further ado, as we have this very nice, hot, sunny day at the beginning of April, I'm just going to curl up on this sofa here, shut all the curtains, put on some ambient music, and read about wizards. I can see why people love this book so much, because it was a bloody fine read. Like, the Technocracy as presented in the core books, because remember, this is my only experience with Mage up until this point, for the most part are presented as this great big cold heartless monolithic group of enlightened scientists who use their enlightened sciences to, well, keep people in check and destroy the hoop and all that emotional jank with the other traditions. When compared to the Guide to the Technocracy, it's a whole other ball game. It actually at times does feel like a different game. It becomes a game of trust, deception, espionage, and there is some emotion in there. There is some humanity to be found within there. You know, other than humans' desire to commit genocide on a mass scale, but that's a conversation for a different time. It was a really fascinating read, just trying to find all these little elements with it. Now granted, a fair amount of that I was sort of picking apart as I was reading the core books, because at the same time I was reading George Orwell's 1984 for the first time. So that was a natural process for me, but to see the rest of it unfold in the Guide to the Technocracy was a very interestingly weird experience. It was interesting reading a much expanded version of their history, because the core books do go into a lot of detail regarding how the Technocracy was set up, how it connected them with different enlightened ways of thinking and philosophies and maths across the eras, as it were. And technically speaking, it started in China. Ancient China, that too, in India, and ancient Egypt. You know, it's very little of it started in the West, or those that did sort of had a lot of catching up to do, so to speak. I think it's rather interesting that the modern concept of the Technocracy was for the Victorian era, which is kind of covered in revised, if memory serves correct. But then again, Guide to the Technocracy came out before revised, just so that would have carried over. I think it's funny that Queen fucking Victoria is a member, was a member I should say, or maybe she still is. Who knows? That could be something you could work into your own personal games. So I think that's rather interesting that the Technocracy is a lot more diverse than one would initially begin to think. I think it's interesting how it defined its magic with science, how there is a reasoning and an understanding for everything, and it presents the traditions as those of the closed mind in all of this. Its different structures and organisation and just the general pyramid structure of things is easy to digest as well. Yes, a lot of it was in the Technocracy section of M20, but as I've mentioned in that part of this experiment in a previous video, it was quite a lot to digest on the context of everything else surrounding it, whereas here it was just easier to understand, really. And it's just given me a lot of ideas to play around with, especially when I started reading the storytelling chapter, which is definitely the highlight of that book. Oh look, there's a surprise. If you listen to any of my book reviews, these storytelling chapters tend to be my favourite bits of the books. Why? Because they do a really good job, usually, of taking everything that's come before it and giving you, okay, here are the tools, this is what you can do with them. And I feel the one for the Guide to the Technocracy really does a fine job for the storyteller to present those ideas and different ideas and themes to work with. And just after that is the appendix, and I think it's fucking hilarious that the Teletubbies of all fucking things is seen as recommended viewing, which I never thought I would find Teletubbies as a fucking source of recommended viewing for anything in World of Darkness game. Like, yeah, it's creepy and eerie as shit, and there's still a couple of episodes that are banned in the UK because they're too frightening for children. I shit you not, go and Google it. It's a one fun, wacky minefield of exploration. No, I remember seeing them as a wee kid, and I turned out mostly alright. But yeah, it's very peculiar, that. And I can kind of see where they're going with it, which is the really weird thing with it as well. So yeah, it's just a weird thing all the same, and I just think the whole book really is great, and it's clear that the authors and the developers had a fun time writing it. You know, writing it as like an in-game guide for new recruits and whatnot, which I think is pretty neat. It's nice when you see the developers and authors have fun with the material like that. So I feel that I understand Mage a lot more now just because I understand more about how the Technocracy works as a storyteller. So I'm able to portray the different angles of the traditions and the Technocracy. And the really weird thing is that I don't think anybody's got the wrong idea of thinking. I just think the Technocracy is just a bit more clued in, but of course they're not exactly the heroes. I mean, they're their own heroes within their own faction, you know, because one man's terrorist and no man's freedom fighter. But they are not the heroes, but they are antagonistic. And you could argue the same with the traditions as well. And it's very difficult to describe, like to truly encapsulate how I feel about one's awakening, as it were, if you pardon the pun, about how the world of Mage, and to an extent the world of darkness, has been opened up to me through my better understanding of the Technocracy. Because you get a source book that adds to the existing world, like a player's guide may add tips and tricks, it may add new bloodlines, there's a little add-ons and bolt-ons and things like that that just expand what you already know, like a bit of DLC, which is essentially what source books are, really, in City by Night books and all the rest of it. But the closest I feel, it feels like, as I said already, like a completely different game. And it's just expanded the world like some fucking Dark Souls, Elden Ring shit. Yes, I'm a TTRPG / game person making the Dark Souls comparison. Like, the closest I feel that I can do that within the TTRPG sense is that when I was getting into Vampire the Masquerade for the first time, and I was learning about the Sabbat, because my first experiences with them was with Bloodlines and V5, both of which present a very animalistic presentation of the Sabbat, that they are just murder hobos that disregard their humanity. Now, of course, you'll know that's not really the case at all, because the Sabbat, for the most part, they're sort of presented as that most of them follow paths of enlightenment, which isn't true, because a bit of nuance is that, well, they can't be old enough and inhumane enough to all follow paths of enlightenment. So what you have is that most of them are neonates who have low levels of humanity, as they're traumatized and beaten into submission within this, like, blood-hungry cult. So there's a bit more nuance in that. But, just to go back a little bit, when I was reading V20 for the first time, and I saw the little chapter within, like, the opening chapters of the V20 core book that talks about the Camera of the Anarchs and Sabbat, and reading about the Codes of Milan, it just opened a part of the game I wasn't aware of, because I knew about the Anarchs, I knew about the Camarilla. But, like, as I said, the Sabbats have sort of unlocked a whole world within Vampire the Masquerade of possibilities, and then seeing the Sabbat exclusive backgrounds, and even like years after this, when I was learning more about the Sabbat rites and how they worked, and even before then, actually, with my research from my Sabbat lore episodes, many years ago that was, and I still get people complaining about the audio mixing being completely out of whack there, but give me some slack, man. But you know, that it just unlocked this whole new world of understanding, like bits of Vampire Masquerade that was just completely missing, that was just this untapped potential, as it were. And I would feel something similar when I first read V20 Dark Ages, which again just opened up a completely different world and a completely different understanding of the game line that I had spent so much time reading and appreciating and critiquing. Like, wow, this is just awesome. And I have had a very similar experience with Mage, with the Technocracy, which I kind of think is a bit weird, because the core books do spend a lot of time just talking about the formation and how the tradition sort of like kind of spun off from that, really, and how they fought against each other, but was only up until like this second edition book a few years down the line that they had their own little source book. I say little, it's quite a little, it's quite a chunky thing. I think that's pretty awesome. And I'm very curious to see what Onyx Path will do with this, with their iteration of the Technocracy book, Technocracy Reloaded. But before we move on, there's a couple of things that I forgot to mention. The first of which, it talks about like alternate settings, like referring to Dark Ages Mages and Mage the Sorcerer's Crusade, or whatever it's called. It's very sparse. Other books that within the World of Darkness line have done this, which from my experience is Werewolf mainly and Vampire. But one for Mage is just very, very lacking, which I think is a bit of a missed opportunity, especially when you have gone through so much of the book, or of a particular chapter, talking about like the Technocracy through the ages, how they came to be in these different parts of these ancient periods where they existed and where they just the ideas began to bubble through. I felt that was a bit of a missed opportunity. That being said, it does throw the most bonkers one out there, and space! Which is so bizarre, thinking that you have whole colonies, cabals, or whatever the wording was, of Technocracy mages just doing their own thing on fucking different planets, just flying around in spaceships and space stations combating aliens. Now, I suspect there will be more information on the Void Engineers tradition book, which I'm not going to read as part of this, but that's just so fucking balmy to me. Like, somehow forgot how ridiculous and ludicrous people describe Mage to be at like the surface stereotypical level. But just the possibilities in that alone, like you just take everything out of Earth and the world is your oyster. And I'm very curious to see how World of Darkness does with aliens, because I think it's a bit interesting they never capitalised on an Alien the Something book, you know, where you just try and coexist on planet Earth as these fucking aliens. But then again, it sort of like treads the line between demon and Vampire the Masquerade, and there's no way to shove Christian faith and ideologies into fucking Martians now, is there? Little grey men in their spaceships. But yeah, it's, you know, they could have done something with that, I guess, but they didn't. And I don't think World of Darkness are going to do anything with that now. They're just going to do the whole fucking Disney and do live action remakes that are worse iterations of their classics. But that is just my totally negatively biased opinion on that matter. So, with that out of the way, now we can return to the Lore by Night Chantry and read Technocracy Reloaded. Oh boy, where do we start with this one? Well, a good place to start with anything is at the beginning, as a wise man once said, and which puts us to the beginning of the book, funny enough, because that tends to help that works. The book, all the way through this, and starting with chapter 1, it is like its opening introductory chapter, presents the Technocracy. They're kind of failing because of how fucked up the world is, to be honest, predominantly in the US, because that's where a lot of the writing is focused here before anybody starts complaining to me in the comments. And it gives it a very informal, conversational start all the way through this, which in some senses is very Onyx-Parthian, if that's even a phrase. If it's not, I'm inventing it now. Which is very familiar to those who've been around with Onyx-Path for some time, or those that are just getting into it, and it makes the Technocracy feel quite human, at least in comparison to the traditions, who present them to be very cold and sterile, like Big Brother trying to wipe everyone out. Although that being said, Big Brother and George Orwell's 1984 is very much the Technocracy, especially with the convention, the New World Order. But with the Guide to the Technocracy, and to an extent this book, Technocracy Reloaded, this informal language sort of make them more feel human. That these are not just your bosses, employers and people that could just make you disappear off the face of the earth, but they're friends and they're colleagues. And it also makes people feel a bit more welcome into this very overwhelming world that is Mage the Ascension, and this whole different spin of things with the Technocracy. Because if you only read the core books like I had done until recently, to an extent the Technocracy are presented as very cold and sterile, and the traditions just want them gone because it's stopping from people ascending to reach their true potential and all the rest of it. Whereas the Technocracy, from their perspective, are trying to uphold and maintain the constant state of reality and to enforce whatever the reality is right now. So if you really think about it in a kind of cartoonish comic book style, they're kind of Men in Black with a bunch of weird magical powers, with a pinch of 1984 in there as well. Only the Technocracy don't use magic, remember. They use enlightened science, and they have a very scientific reasoning for everything, which puts a completely different spin on things. And with this book and Guide to the Technocracy, if you're playing a member of the Technocracy in one of their conventions, it feels like you're playing this very weird magical espionage game, which makes it very, very, very different from the Traditions book. And that's all very cool. And the first chapter and its introductory chapter is very good at painting the scene, and it's all very good at presenting it as, you know, we're going to present some things here that you won't recognise, some things have been changed, and going to do the whole fucking Future Fate scene stuff that I've talked about in the previous video of this experiment. And it's this sort of informal language that sort of adds to the consistently inconsistent messaging throughout the rest of the book that sort of panders to two different sorts of people, but not really speaking to either of them. And if that doesn't make much sense to you, allow me to explain. Like, think about how I've just described the Technocracy so far. Now, with a bit of critical thinking, you can probably imagine that the Technocracy mirrors a lot of fascist ideologies, right? And how it sort of mirrors a lot of stereotypical presentions of, like, monopolies and massive corporations and whatnot, which means they are mostly ruled by middle-aged white men, cis, heterosexual, some of them are maybe elderly if they're lucky enough. And in the terms of the technocracy with mages, who can, you know, bend the properties of biology to make themselves, you know, essentially immortal, or as near as one can allow, they've probably been in charge for quite some time. So just making that point before anybody gets wound up before I'm bringing in woke ideology. Anywho, and Technocracy Reloaded acknowledges all of that, which I think is a pretty cool thing. It talks about like the modern inception of the technocracy, what would become after the Order of Reason, you know, a bunch of entitled, privileged white men, and Queen Victoria establishing the Order, for which she is a member herself, which I think is still fucking ridiculous. And they'd obviously go off and do their own things and, you know, participate and encourage a bunch of colonialism, really. And if you think that's all very fucking stupid and I'm being woke again, look at how many countries have the United Kingdom on their fucking flag. Anywho, it acknowledges all of that, acknowledges the amount of rimming the UK has done for years, which I'm very glad that it does, because I've always stood by the fact that the UK has always tried so hard to be what the US is, which is such a fucking shit idea, really. Like, we rim the US so fucking much that it makes the unwilling participants of the human centipede blush. But I'm getting a bit off topic here. Like, it acknowledges all these ideas. There's a whole section of the third chapter that talks about diversity and disability, which is great. You know, if there's a company that I can trust to do all this stuff really well and talk about it, it is Onyx Path, because a load of its writers are disabled. They have gone through various like mental and health traumas, and I'm not trying to trivialise things, it's just talking to different authors and whatnot and having an insight to how a load of these books are made. So it comes from a lot of personal experiences and alongside a load of research as well. Onyx Path is a very diverse team, so there's nothing bad with the writing in of itself. It just wildly contrasts the established idea of the technocracy that this essentially is a fascist magic organisation. But that's okay, because they're doing their best to be inclusive. And then we go back a little bit to talk a bit about, you know, the people who are probably ruling the ship, as it were. Now, it's not mentioned by name who these individuals are, which I think is a kind of a weird choice, knowing Onyx Path, because they kind of dived into previous source books about like the people who run Pentex. Yes, granted, those names were already mentioned in older books, but they never had to. They could have been a bit mysterious about it. And I guess it kind of makes sense, as this whole Technocracy Reloaded book is presented like a big fucking huge handbook sort of thing for an agent, so an agent may not know, but it can't quite work out what it wants to be, which kind of goes back to what I was originally saying before I got into tangent number 2, where it's not, as I said, it's trying to be inclusive and like this big, almost happy clappy sort of family sort of thing, which I suppose if you read between the lines, it does put up red flags, because any company who has a boss or a CEO or manager who says, oh, we're all a happy family here, we can all trust each other, doesn't really mean that. What they mean is that I deserve your loyalty, and it doesn't really happen the other way round. So that could have been the idea behind it. And as I said, I'm very glad that Onyx Path have acknowledged like the previous sins, as it were, of the technocracy, and they have highlighted diversity and disability and gender and non-binary and all these other different things that is in like these few pages of that specific chapter. And it's well written. It just doesn't quite fit the technocracy in a sense. But again, you can read between the lines. Any company can say and do all these things and put in the research, but do they actually action on it? Well, the book says that they do. I don't know, it just feels a bit weird to me. And it's also a bit weird to me that the book talks a lot about disability, but then you have a sidebar at the bottom of one of the pages that briefly touches upon neurodiversity, but then tells you to read it in another fucking book, which in a weird sense is a little ableist. And that brings on to another issue that I have with this book. There are so many instances where you are told to read, I've forgotten the fucking name of the book, like the Book of Secrets is going to appear on the fucking screen right now, which might as well be the book of all the essential shit that we couldn't quite fit into our 700-page fucking core book. Like, it's super frustrating when I'm trying to read and understand the technocracy, and there's a fucking sidebar that says, oh, to learn about how the technocracy members are punished when they do shit wrong, go and read this book. Why is that not mentioned or reprinted in the book that's talking about the whole fucking ranks of them, and like failing a mission causes them to move down, but you don't tell me more about how they're punished? Also, why is that sidebar not mentioned there? Why is it mentioned like literally a couple of hundred pages later? Like, and I know this is going to be quite funny for people that I'm reacting the way that it is, but it was an incredibly frustrating process. It was literally every 2 or 3 fucking pages while I was being told to read the book of all the essential shit that I couldn't fit into the fucking 700-page core book. And I was having a look at a copy of the PDF I've owned for a few years now. I believe it was from some sale that Onyx Path had a few years ago of their Mage stuff. They went through all the different World of Darkness lines. I think it was from that anyway. And yeah, it's super frustrating. Like, all the different things that should have belonged, not just that book, but the core book as well. And there's even a section of that book, like a Q&A thing, like, why was this book made? Like, fucking get an editor to get rid of that shit. No one gives a shit. Just give us the information that we need to run that aspect of the game that you want to run. I would really like all the Technocracy stuff to be in your dedicated Technocracy book, so I can learn more about them. And for fuck's sake, reading the bit about the conventions in that book, and then it tells me to go and read the convention books that Onyx Path mostly filled out, and I say mostly because they follow the revised edition meta plot, and White Wolf only got as far as doing Iteration X, and they left the other 4 because Mage fucking ended at that point. Great job, guys. And everything's just so tonally weird. But then I see the date on those books is fucking 10 years older than the Guide to the Technocracy, which you've encouraged us not to read because it's so out of date. Well, again, the politics and the systems and our understanding and conversations regarding race, diversity, gender, and the lack of thereof is so wildly different for 2012 to what it is in 2021 and beyond. And yes, again, I'm just going to bring up again that in 2015, I want to say, that M20 first came out. That big old block that I talked about in the previous video that got so many people on my YouTube comments shitting themselves because how dare Onyx Path make their fucking Mage game all very fucking gay? Because there's definitely nothing straighter than mages that can turn the fabric of time inside out. Gaffed, clutch the pearls. Like, come on, people. Like, did we not have our editors look through this bit properly? And this iteration of the Technocracy is so over-reliant on anacronyms, which really doesn't make it easy for players to understand and get into their shoes, especially when you're trying to make things far more human and not more sort of babble, or whatever it's fucking called in Guide to the Technocracy, which is something that book actively discourages. Like, it refers to the maze as TBEs, which is the Tinkerbell effect. Really? That's the best that we could do. Like, you give everything else for your reality deviant, which is essentially everything else supernatural that isn't a Technocracy Mage, a semi-scientific name, but the Tinkerbell effect was the best that we could do. Okay. Whatever. Like, if it's not apparent already, I found this book a very frustrating book to read. Like, the beginning was alright, and I liked the storytelling chapter, surprise, surprise, but by that point I was just ready to fucking put the book back on my shelf. Like, I do like the fact that the storytelling chapter does encourage storytellers to do, like, your sort of the day-to-day activity role-playing with Technocracy Mages, so it's not just in and out with missions all the time, which sort of makes them feel a bit more human, which is, funny enough, is something that the Guide to the Technocracy doesn't cover in all that much, and it just sort of made me smile and chuckle a little bit thinking about, like, your sort of slice of life sort of scenarios, which also could be used to introduce some of those more political and corrupt ideas that the book mentions as well. So they can go around and ask questions and meet alliances and adversaries and form rivalries, and you've got 2 different, like, I forget their word for cabals, and I don't really care, I'm not going to bother putting up on screen. There's 2 different groups going off against each other, like one group of agents that always one step ahead against another one. You know, there's so many different possibilities with that, and I think it's really cool that Onyx Path included in that. They're very good at making their games, or the games they've inherited, I should say, with regards to White Wolf's World of Darkness, feel human, or have some more of those human elements in there, because it's these wild contrasts that really makes the horror stand out a lot more. Like, the calms between the storm are often too calm, and then crash, bang, wall up, everything goes up the fucking wazoo again. So that's cool. But everything else I just thought was like, how do you do, fellow kids? Like, it's a real shame that. But as I said, I was expecting this to be a fucking Marmite book, and I got Marmite with 2 tablespoons worth of piss and shit. Now, with that bit of madness running around your head, I'm now going to go and read the Book of Madness, open bracket, revised, close bracket. So in comparison to the other Mage the Ascension books I've read thus far, the Book of Madness Revised is the smallest of the bunch. However, it's also surprisingly packed filled with information, which is a really cool thing indeed. Now, at this point of the recording/video, I haven't read all the book yet, and I thought I would break down the chapters bit by bit, so we're going to have like 3-ish parts. One for the Nefandi, one for the Marauders, and one for Infernalism and or the rest of the chapter, because I know that book has bits on Infernalism, and I'm sure there's going to be a storytelling chapter as well, so just playing it by ear basically. So, this morning I have finished reading the bit on the Nefandi, and I feel that I have a much better understanding about them now. Like, in many ways, it's kind of mirroring my thoughts about how one would go about playing the Black Spiral Dancers, primarily as a storyteller, because I did cover how to, well, should you play as a Black Spiral Dancer as a player, in that they are, well, they have no redeeming qualities whatsoever, participating in all the twisted fun shit of rape, abduction, torture and all the rest of it. But the thing that surprised me more is the nuance with these mages. You have your straight up infernalists, you have those that serve the worm, and then you have those that serve much higher beings, which I think is a little I think it's implying with that other faction that they're sort of worshipping demons or some sort of other eldritch abomination, which sort of differs a little bit from the infernalism because of the very much human-centric speaking, inducting the sort of thing with that. Then you have those that serve the worm, and then you have everything else, and they have their own little hideaways called labyrinths, which isn't and should be confused with the labyrinth from Wraith of the Oblivion, because it's actually got a lot of ties with that, to such an extent that they get these mad dreams from sleeping Malthians, and when they wake up, they lose a snippet of their power. The Technocracy are now aware of this, and now they have this goal of waking up the Malthians, with little care to what happens in the Shadowlands, because it kind of feeds into what they're wanting to do, which is absolutely fucking batshit bonkers, and I love that. That's a really cool detail and a very interesting way to have a crossover game with Wraith and Mage, that possibly these Malthians are just popping up. It could be like an end of the world scenario that you could run, and I'm actually a little bit surprised that Empire didn't have that as like a alternate setting, much like the other end of the world World of Darkness books would. I love it how the book defines their application of the spheres, which is essentially the sphere that you would expect with like a weird looking Q word in front of it, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce. Like, you would assume to begin with that if they were going to have a special understanding of things, it would just be the inverse of things, so you'd have magic Q word and life would be killing things. Yes and no, because the inverse of that would be entropy, which is like death and decay, but their version of life is more sucking the life out of you through really twisted means, through like cancerous growths or tumors on the brain sort of thing, which is rather messed up. And you have things like, I think it's correspondence, which is like to do with distance and space and that sort of stuff, where it's more they just essentially remove and delete things out of existence and create massive tears in reality for them to step and walk through. Their version of Prime, they're sort of able to like attack the avatar of mages and drain the quintessence off of a mage that way. Just stuff like that. And I think that's really, really cool. Messed up, for sure, and just another reason why the players shouldn't be able to get their hands on them, although I'm sure there is a revised edition book somewhere that gives you advice for that. I know M20's Book of Secrets does, in a big old box, but no one ever really recommends it because of how dark and twisted things are, which, you know, has its merits and its flaws for sure. One thing I do find a little frustrating with that is that you don't really have a lot of information for those things, despite being quite packed across a couple of pages. Like the other spheres, you got like the little dots example about what each level can do sort of thing, but you don't have that with this. Now, I don't know if that was done to discourage players from using them, but it would be nice as an ST, especially somebody who's brand new to the system, such as your Lore Saviour here, could have that, so they can have a bit of an understanding about the true potential of these special versions of the spheres, you know? I think there's a little bit of a missed opportunity. Now, that being said, it may pop up in the storytelling chapter, which I haven't read yet. But given it wasn't mentioned there, I don't think it's going to be there at all. But you know what, I could be mistaken. So yes, I think the Nefandi are really fucked up and very interesting bunch, and there's a lot of potential to put them in other games beside Mage the Ascension. I think it's really interesting. They've got like their own version of essentially the Necronomicon and other works. I love it how they're included in pen text in ways that you wouldn't immediately expect. I think it's funny they have their paws in the evangelists, which is a word I can never pronounce properly, because, you know, I'm always in for poking fun at the Christians, but also it kind of makes a lot of sense given how a lot of them, in a stereotypical sense, do it for more selfish and manipulative reasons rather than wanting to help and save people. They're more interested in helping and saving their own bank accounts. That all being said, it would have been nice if there was just a bit more information about the sort of things they do to fuck around with people. Yeah, there's quite a lot about their indoctrination processes, as it were, and the examples they have given has given me a good enough idea and understanding to run wild with it. It would have been nice just to see a little bit more, and maybe just a bit more explanation about what the different factions would have done, how they differ from each other, because it's all kind of a big old cesspool of the same sort of shit, to be honest, which has its merits and its flaws as well. But yeah, that's really all I have to say at the moment. I mean, it's going to take me a few more readings to properly understand their iterations of the spheres, I feel, because there's a lot to them there, and obviously reread the book when I need to refresh myself on all things Nefandi. That is before I move on to the 20th anniversary edition book, which I have not read yet. But so far, this is a pretty good start to a pretty dark book. You know what? With the few Mage the Ascension books that I've read so far, I think Book of Madness Revised is my favourite, just because of the Marauders chapter. Because there hasn't been a single bit of Mage writing so far that has engaged me so wholeheartedly as this one chapter, and it's unfortunately a really short one as well. You've got like the first 2 or 3 pages talking about more about the Marauders and what they're like, that for the most part they're not really a faction, because that's something that I completely missed or didn't understand or whatever, that the Marauders for the most part are not a faction of mages because of how warped their reality is, because Paradox just isn't really a thing for them, or not to the extent that it is with practically every type of other mage. There are some factions mentioned in this book, and they're understandably quite quirky. But it's really made me understand a lot more about how fucking frightening that they are. I didn't properly appreciate just, oh, you're just in and around them, and it's just, reality itself is like a completely different concept for them. That you walk past them and you end up in a different fucking time zone or some other imaginary landscape. I didn't realise that. I thought it was all, I mean, I got that they were mad, but I thought it was all very purposeful, that they're deliberately fucking with reality. No, they're just fucked, and that's terrifying. Like, I could see how it can lean a bit more towards like fishmouth territory. But a lot of it isn't. They think they're fine. They don't understand what's going on. They think that everything's all hunky-dory. That's just reality for them now. And everyone that walks past them, including other mages, unless they're strong enough to repel it as such. Wow. Like, it was really pulled into it. I love reading that. And most of the chapter was focused about making them as player characters rather than as a storytelling device, which I get it. I understand that how becoming a state of quiet and how Paradox finally deals its final blow to a mage is different for everyone, depending on the scenario in question. But oh boy, I didn't really want that. I wanted more advice about potentially including them in games as NPCs. That chapter also talks about the Marauders' usage of the spheres, which, unlike the Nefandi before them in this book, are regular spheres, but just how the Marauders incorporate it into their reality warping, conscious or otherwise. And it gives dots and some examples for most of the spheres, which is something that the Nefandi one didn't do, which is kind of frustrating, but at the same time really useful as you're trying to work out what is exactly needed for an NPC Marauder to do what they do, which is helpful. Not as starting characters, admittedly, but as player characters, that is. But it's a lot more useful to incorporate them on a statistic level than it is with the Nefandi, I feel. But yeah, ultimately I feel the chapter's just very, very short, and I kind of understand why, because what could you say about mad mages? Or how could you expand upon that further? Well, I don't know. Well, I mean, I would have liked a bit more storytelling advice about them. Again, they may have like a bit in the storytelling chapter of the book, but it would make sense to include that within that bit of the chapter, you know? But who knows? What do I fucking know? At the moment, very little, because I'm still reading the fucking book. And despite my qualms with it, I am glad that there is advice of making player Marauder characters, because there's always going to be that one person where that's going to happen to in-game, or you may have an all-Marauder group, which I'm glad that they considered that, and they had a little bit of a discussion about that. The key word being little, because there's very little advice on all of that, which is a shame really, but as I said already, what can one say about writing about mad wizards? You know, that hasn't been said already. Well, just a bit more of everything would have been nice. It was a really engaging chapter, but it's far too short, like, I dare say, maddeningly short. I'm honestly not going to spend much time talking about the infernalism bit of the book, because quite frankly, I didn't really gain anything useful from it, other than the fucking obvious what the different traditions and conventions think about infernalism and ways that it corrupts them from within. Like, I think a lot of that was fairly straightforward. The following chapter, The Unbrewed, which is basically the chapter on spirits, which is such a weird tack on to me, especially with how it's written with like two mages in email conversation with each other. It just felt like a fucking weird tonal and quality whiplash, if I'm being totally honest. And as somebody who has read a lot of Way of the Apocalypse material, what was presented just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Which very quickly leads me onto the storytelling chapter, which is both equal parts frustrating and really fucking engaging. Let's start with the latter first. Like, it mostly focuses on the Marauders, which kind of teases our way about why I find it a particularly frustrating chapter. And role-playing madness, i.e. the madness within the Marauders, as a mental illness. Now, to those of you who lack the nuance and the understanding, that seems like a very problematic thing to do. But just think through how mental health and madness have correlated with each other throughout the annals of history. Like, if you were depressed, you were thrown in an asylum, for example. And that sort of perpetuated a little bit through more modern times, such as the late 90s, early noughties period when this book was being developed and released. That if you were to tell somebody that you were feeling depressed, somebody would make you feel like a fucking crazy person. Like, I can talk very confidently about one time when I was at school. It had its own sixth form unit, which is like a college or high school setting, but it's much smaller and closed off. And if you call it sixth form, it means you're from a very middle class or upper class upbringing, such as my school was. Anyway, and in the sixth form, I was coming to terms that, yeah, I'm depressed, and I have felt depressed for many years now, on top of a bunch of other things I won't go into for now. And I was trying to consult with a teacher that I felt very confident that would take me seriously and listen to me, because I had a huge amount of trust with them. And when I said, you know what, I'm feeling a little bit depressed, the look that they gave me was as if I just dropped my trousers and took a fat shit on their desk. And I was told to something to the effect of, oh, be careful who you tell that to, because people think you're crazy. And I didn't speak about it for a few years after that, because I believed them, which is a shame, because I think if I was a bit more open about it from the get-go and actually had proper therapy, I wouldn't be in such a bad state that I am. Maybe I would have been, who knows, but it's a very interesting angle to take with the Marauders, and it really pushes the angle with them, and to the extent in the Nefandi, that this could happen to you, especially with the Marauders. You may be overwhelmed by this madness, that this warped sense of reality, and I suppose those with some mental illness do, to a very minor extent, see and feel the world differently. Like, I can't speak too confidently about this because I'm obviously not an expert in this field. But people who suffer from bipolar disorder experience their emotions, the things around them, differently to somebody who doesn't. Which is also different to somebody who is depressed or has anxiety, you know? Like, as I said, I can't speak too confidently on that because I don't have these things, but I think you can understand even at a base surface level, just how things will be different for them, and just how these things are portrayed in media, which a lot of the time is incredibly offensive. So I think taking that angle with the Marauders makes them far more sympathetic than one would initially assume, which I think is a wonderful direction to do that, to be honest. And it touches upon the Nefandi a little bit, because, you know, you could still be corrupted and gaslit and abused into these really horrible situations. So that's an interesting angle as well. But a reason why I find it so frustrating, and I think you might have worked this out already, is that, to me, everything in the story chapter, or the vast majority of which, should have just been with the Marauders chapter. Like, the Book of Madness Revised definitely feels like the equivalent of a convention book or tradition book, but for the Marauders, honestly. Yeah, by some definition of the word, the Nefandi are fucking mad, batshit crazy, one could argue. But the stuff to do with the infernalism and the unbrewed just feels a bit weirdly placed, if I'm being totally honest. And the Nefandi portion, in comparison to everything else, just feels like a very useful but frustratingly short summary of events, which I just wanted a bit more. And I feel I have a lot of information to work with now with the Marauders, and putting them in a game and portraying them as sympathetic antagonists. But it really should have gone with the book, and I now am beginning to feel that everything that was put in there outside of the Marauders just feels like it was just slapped on for page count, which is really unpleasant feeling to feel about such a great book. Or maybe they could have just padded out the Nefandi bit and just had these two big bits, and then just do a much larger storytelling chapter that talks about all of them, and, you know, puts examples of the spheres and some possible routes for STs to use, etc. and so forth. That would have been really useful, but it just felt they need to slap on this infernalism bit, which we've all seen and heard 100 times if you've read any fucking Word of Darkness book, because infernalism is covered just about everywhere in some capacity. But hey ho, choices were made, I suppose. So in short, the Book of Madness Revised is a fucking great book, I feel. That just leaves me very frustrated, because I just wanted more of everything, because for the most part what was there was pretty good, and I just want a bit more just to tease and tickle the brain juices, as it were. And I feel that, well, I suspect that many a Mage fan would have felt a bit frustrated by this too, maybe with the Nefandi bit. And I know there is that, like, the Sorcerer's Crusade, or whatever it's fucking called, book that talks about the Nefandi and relating it back to infernalism. I don't know if that came out before or after this book, so I suppose in that sense they may have had a bit more to work with. But what about in more the modern times? Well, it'd have to be a good 20-year wait before the Nefandi would get their own dedicated book in a modern setting. And by that point, the social and political climate would have changed so much that there's a lot more to say and do with them, I guess. And unlike hardcore fans who've had to wait a good 20 years for said book, I just have to wait 20 minutes to get home and start reading the Book of the Fallen from Mage to the Ascension 20th Anniversary Edition. So unlike the other Made the Ascension books in these experiments we've been working through together, I've given myself a few days to reflect on what I just read rather than recording my thoughts that particular morning or the following day, because I really needed to reflect upon the information in this book a lot more, purely because there's a lot in there, and a lot of it is very dark and twisted, which I'll explore in a moment, and I just needed a bit more time to reflect upon it a bit more. That, and as of the recording this particular segment on the 1st of May 2025 in the year of our Lord Talos, I'm focusing most of my attention on looking after my youngest dog, who had a pretty major operation. I've left a link in the description below that talks about that in a community post, because I'm not going to talk about that here because it's not really necessary. I will give you a trigger warning for said post. It's to do with animal neglect and abuse, nothing to do with me but the previous owners. But that aside, yeah, the Book of or the Book of the Fallen, is very well written, and I don't think it's entirely appropriate to say that I enjoyed reading it just because of its subject matters, but it is very well written. As I mentioned earlier on, it was written by two authors, Phil Procrato and Jacqueline Brick, which I'm only mentioning because I mentioned it earlier in the video, but also in the previous video of this experiment. And also, it's quite common for World of Darkness books to have more than one author on them, like a group of people, like as a team working together. But given the subject matter, I do think that it was best to have as few as voices as possible, muddying the waters and having the potentiality of like gamifying this particular subject matters in this book. Because I jested a moment ago calling it the Book of Evil, because I think it's a very good source book in wanting to play really fucking diabolical, abusive characters. And abuse is the key word here, because it's really like a one-to-one guide of how to not only gaslight and abuse people, but also to recognize it in both yourself and from other situations. So when I say that it's a book like how to abuse people, I'm talking like purely as like a role-play thing. I'm not saying that the developers came from this to, oh, you should use this book to abuse your players and make them feel really uncomfortable and like take advantage of them. No, the book mentions at many different points that you shouldn't do that, and I'll touch upon that point in a moment, but I just wanted to clear that up before anybody like has a go at these two individuals, and or Onyx Path or World of Darkness or whatever, or me for that matter, especially when I just said that I think it's very well written. And knowing Jacqueline Brick a bit more than the other author, I actually don't know them at all, but as I'm in friendly terms with Jacqueline Brick, I actually like to think that we're friends on some degree, and also quite familiar with their work, both in and out of TTRPGs. I was able to like highlight and pick apart certain bits, which is kind of nice and a wonderful privilege that I'm able to have, so it's good to see that Jacqueline's work has been unfiltered, I guess, and the editing process hasn't been too firm with them, like trying to whitewash or water things down, because I think it's really important for a book like this to be as full on as it is. Although I will say that when I posted on social media that I had just finished reading the Book of Madness Revised and I was going to go on to reading the Book of the Fallen, there was one comment that said, yeah, just skip the first chapter because it's a whole trauma dump, which, having read that chapter, I can't understand where they're coming from, because it's definitely the most messed up part of the book, I think, because it's literally just a very depressing, nihilistic and borderline edgy like whiz-stop tour of all the weird and horrible shitty things that people do, like your neighbour could be doing this, somebody down the street's doing that, the priest is doing this sort of thing. It's a very bleak outlook on the world and society as a whole, and how humanity was a big old mistake and somebody really needs to nip this whole fucking thing in the bud. Which, you know, kind of looking about the state of the world at the moment and what's happening across the pond, as we say, in the barely United Kingdom, there are elements of it that I do agree with, but not to the extent that we should wipe everything out. I do think that we are capable of changing and doing better. It's just at the moment we are letting the fascists and the right, the politically right, I should say, win, which is not fantastic at all. But it's a very interesting little monologue from this Nefandi Mage narrator, just to really get into the mindset, how they are painting themselves as these protagonists, because obviously it's very clear they're not cartoonish villains, they don't treat themselves as such, and nor does the writing ever treat them like that. And even with the previous Book of Madness, I highlighted that they don't see themselves and should be treated like Dr. Evil, sort of like mustache twirling Saturday cartoon sort of affair. But it does help to see where they're coming from, and it does help to understand that they believe that they're doing a service to not just humanity, but to the earth as a whole. They want to eliminate everything and just let nature take its course sort of thing, but without any of the nature inspired elements to it. There's no they're not like extreme eco-terrorists. It's not like they're the human black spiral dancers, who do get a mention in this book actually, because one of the chapters talks about and expands upon the different factions within the Nefandi, because we talked upon earlier on, your Fernalists, the ones that are completely driven by chaos and more borderline demonic, and then you've got the other ones that are like full on, not really human anymore, shall we say, in all senses of the word. But this book also addresses some new factions that have other influences within the Nephandic Mage Order thing. And none of them really see it to eye. They're all sort of walking towards the same courses. some doing it more directly than others. I'm not going to mention the names because I think you should go and read them about yourself. It's very similar to how the conventions and the traditions are set out in respective Mage the Ascension books, even touching upon the choice of foci, or their focus, which is like their instruments of their trade, so what they need to use to focus on when they're applying their magic, which I actually really appreciate, because it wasn't until I read that in this book, I might have missed this completely with Book of Madness, but that's not really talked upon at all about what the Nefandi mages or the Marauder mages use when they're using their own magics. And I think if I had completely missed it, and I probably need to go and reread those bits, but I definitely know that was not mentioned in the Marauder book, and it's just interesting to think, what would they hone on, for example? Probably items in that specific space of reality. I don't know. It's just left more questions than answers, I suppose. But it's nice that in this book, and I'm gesturing over there because the book I have there for the reference, it's nice that it has all those foci mentioned, and it's also helpful for the ST to portray these different mages, how to go about doing them, how these different factions separate themselves more, and how these different mages organize themselves. And I forget which one it is and how they're structured, but like you have a mage of this rank and then a few of this rank, and there's always at least one black spiral dancer amongst them, which introduces a very interesting crossplay element, again with Way of the Apocalypse that made Ascension, which I think is very interesting. It talks a bit more about the labyrinth here, not as much as Book of Madness, interestingly enough, which I think is a good thing, because if you start introducing too many cross-splat ideas, it sort of muddies the waters a little bit, and that's not really the focus of this book. So I kind of like that one book got its own theme, and this book talks a lot more about the Nefandi culture, the upbringing, and the really twisted mindset that they have. There's also mentioning of like merits and flaws that they can have, attaching and removing body parts and replacing them with more demonic fiends, and having like demonic servitors and other weird and twisted creatures like that. Like, there's a whole system for adding bits in here, and you might be thinking, well, this isn't a storyteller, but why would you feel the need to add these elements at all to gamifying things a bit? Well, because part of it is that I think the authors immediately knew there was always going to be that one group that wanted to play a game where everybody's an Nefandi, or somebody plays the Dark Descent, because I feel there is some narrative worth exploring in such games, I feel. And also, as the book highlights it, is that it does it to help you understand the mindset and what they're working with, what they're working towards. It's also nice to have that, if you're just overwhelmed with all this information, that you can just having something a bit like gamified, like some game mechanics to work with that you can bend and tweak to fit your own imagination, which is always appreciated, because you don't have to follow things word for word, system to system. It's a big old toolbox of things that you can use, and I appreciate the fact that's included in there. Even it's just like a source of inspiration for a fucked up ST. And all of this also helps to make the Nefandi feel more human, because even if you have the nuance to understand that they're not just like Dr. Evil mustache twirling nihilistic supervillains, it's a bit difficult on the surface level from what I've described and what I had read up until this point to introduce them into a game, because really out of the three major factions of Book of Madness, you only had one that was based solely on Earth and interacted with the mortals, trying to pull them in that way through the good old trick of infernalism, whilst the other two are a bit more detached. So unless the players are wanting to go and explore more twisted realms within like the Shadowlands or space or whatever, it would be a bit harder to find more of those, I guess, wacky elements. And unless the players are going to go looking for more darker elements, for you to bring those darker elements in, that just might be a bit more difficult. But with here, introducing these additional factions does help that as well. Just make them feel more human, and I dare say a little bit more relatable, just to understand how this brand or these brands of evil works. And there's also mentioning of like different organisations that some of these Nefandic mages run. Like there's this nightclub that's mentioned that's as completely as fucked up as you could imagine it to be. One of these newer factions of Nefandi mages, all technology based, which is very fitting given how misinformation is running rampant towards the 2020s. And these sort of things also helps to legitimise things a bit more about them working with Pentex, which is mentioned here as well. Because, again, looking back with this book in comparison, it kind of feels like, oh, they're working with Pentex because we've assigned them with the worm, and therefore it only makes sense that they work together. But it didn't really make much sense beyond that. other than that's just what they do and have these ties to the Black Spiral Dancers. But now the mages on each level have some understanding and reasoning to be working with pentext. That's not to say that every single mage within them knows about pentext, but you get what I mean. So yeah, as I've mentioned many times now, all of what's presented in here does help the Nefandi feel more human, albeit really unpleasant ones. So you, the ST, can find ways of having the Nefandi gaslight and manipulate player characters and other NPCs into the ranks of the Nefandi, just to roleplay some of those more darker elements of Mage the Ascension. Because one thing I think it does really well here is that, whereas the Mage the Ascension books talks about the Ascension and reaching the higher state, the Nefandi have like their inverted version of this, which I think is a very interesting discussion, because obviously they do not believe or practice the Ascension like the mages do, and their spheres, as touched upon in Book of Madness, are the inverse of this. Which I have to say, the description of these in this book were not as captivating to me as they were in a Book of Madness, and that weird Q word that I talked about earlier on is mentioned here and is explored upon. That is done a lot better, but the spheres themselves, a bit lackluster. And one thing I also found pretty annoying whilst I remember this is that there's a group of these Nefandi mages that like revere and worship Baphomet, but a nickname for them are the Goatsies, which isn't the best name, honestly. You can go and Google what a Goatsie is, but I have to warn you not to do it while you're at work. Anywho, there's a far more serious matter within the book that I'm not particularly fond of, and it's kind of related to the whole Technocracy Reloaded situation. It doesn't really want you to use its book, and I kind of feel that this book, Book of Fallen in particular, is exceptionally apologetic and really does not want you to use the information that's here. It feels like it's meeting some sort of popular demand just to shut people up. Because, for example, if I just pick up my copy here, lovely stuff, and we have it open up on the first page, I think it's even before the credits page, no, it's just after the credits page, you have a author's preface, 2 pages, that is the content warning and warning you that evil's not a toy, which, like every Mage the Ascension book that I've read thus far that talks about the Nefandi, which admittedly is not a lot, it makes a point saying that the Nefandi are not meant to be playable because they're twisted, abusive, all the rest of it, blah blah blah. So it does it on the first bit. Right, in the first sentence of this preface is even said, I promised long ago that I would never release a player's guide to the Nefandi. This isn't one. Here's why. And it mentions it. However, it then does the same, almost, at the back, which I'm not going to read to you, but it expands a lot more about what's presented at the front, and I'm just thinking, why put that in twice? Why not just have like a 4-page preface rather than well, maybe it's because a warning going in and then you've read everything and then an explanation of what you just read at the end. I don't really know. The book, as I've mentioned already, tells you many times not to roleplay these elements ever, which I understand the ethos behind it, and I don't think that most groups would ever want to touch things like rape or some of the examples of abuse that are mentioned in there, which, to be honest, I'm not one of them either. I don't want to force that shit on my players because that's just like an obvious fucking no-no. It can just be assumed or like a fade to black or something that's mentioned off screen, or like, oh, such and such was released from jail because whatever, such and such. You know, it doesn't have to be explored in terms of like some twisted ERP or forcing the players to go through that or watch or participate in it, which is totally understandable. There's a lot more effective ways to portray evil, as this book talks about a lot, and any experienced games master will be able to portray that well enough. But given the amount of detail that it talks about portraying its the Fanny's understanding of magic, interaction with people, their ethos, and the number of times it tells you not to portray these certain things, and how apologetic its storytelling chapter towards the end is, even the little bit that talks about if you want to replay a Nefandi group, it's going to fall to shit pretty quickly. Why are you doing this? What a sort of thing. It's a wee bit frustrating that someone somewhere somehow made the decision to commit to the bit to mention it more than once, because kind of, as I said with Technocracy Reloaded, you mention these things are problematic once, maybe twice. Like, people might not read the preface, and they might just like move on with the rest of the book, so like mention it here. And maybe the fact that it's mentioned more than once is to cover basis, because if they mention one particular thing and they say don't do that, but they don't mention it with somebody else, you're going to have some sort of like Twitter social justice warrior who's only complaining about those things to seem relevant and important and wanting to seem like a good person. Say, oh, Onyx Path / World of Darkness is encouraging this specific type of abuse. But on the other side, you also have groups of players that are saying, oh, we can definitely try this out because Onyx Path gave us the A-OK. Which is a sad state of affairs, because players don't read, or they choose not to read, and then choose to bitch and moan and complain about it for one reason or another, which is a really sad state of affairs, really. So I get why it's included so much. I just wish that they hadn't have done, because most people would probably read a book like this from front to back. But then again, players are infamous for not reading the fucking books properly, so silly me, I guess. It's a weird juxtaposition. Like, you're presenting them all these goodies to throw at your players just to really get them to understand how twisted and nasty, to put it nicely, weird sentence, the Nefandi are, and what you could put NPCs and the players through. But they tell you not to do that. Even with the conversations about, like, consent in gaming, lines and bells, safety tools, consent sheets and all the rest of it, and knowing the work that Jacqueline Brick has, I guess, now infamously worked on with Vampire the Masquerade 5th edition, with they doing the whole safety and play consent thing at the back. It's a bit strange that that wasn't really... that was the direction that they went with that. Maybe it was somebody higher up, maybe it was a decision that they made. Which, again, this isn't me saying that you should definitely force this shit on your players. This is not me saying to do away with consent in gaming. Absolutely not. I've done 2 videos on this. One of them is considerably larger than the other. One of them is more modern than the other. You can go and check that out by just looking on my fucking channel. It's just, you present something that's so diabolical in all senses of the word, and evil, and then you act in this very apologetic manner. I don't think it's really needed. I mean, again, I point out on the back, content warning, this book contains material of a dark, mature nature. You've got the 2 prefaces, because I think most people would go to pick up the book. Well, not quite the same with this one. It would apply a little bit. Like, you get the book in the post, you find it in the store, you can open it up and a little flick through, see what it looks like. You find a little preface, you know, on both covers, you know, sort of thing, and the back cover, so really it's done 3 times, plus all the other times it's mentioned in the book. It's, you know, it's a little frustrating, I feel. At least I don't have the frustration where the Technocracy are trying to be inclusive, but they're really a bunch of fucking fascists and, you know, tyrannical bastards that are found fucking revel in their diabolical nature, so it just feels a bit weird to mention it all the time, in my opinion. So that's kind of my thoughts and opinions on it, to be honest. On the one hand, this book is a fucking great case study for recognising and portraying and fighting against the human emotions of evil and abuse. That's the real main focus of this book. Like, it's a big old trauma dump of dealing with handling with abuse, and I think that it's beautifully crafted, and I genuinely think that everyone should read it just so that you can protect yourselves and your friends and family, and also how to take appropriate actions to go against that, which is a really weird fucking thing talking about a TTRPG book. But you know what, if it's a great source of that sort of thing, fucking invest like a 20 quid, which is roughly how much it was. You know, just having that information to hand and like being able to use those tools both in and out of game. And whilst I have a lot of really cool ideas of portraying the Nefandi and like putting some really twisted, fucked up shit into this game, it also gives me a lot of ideas of what not to do, for better and for worse, which is, for me personally, a little frustrating. As is the fucking sound of that construction work that's just sounded outside my house. If I'm being totally honest with you lot, I don't know what to do with this book, because I haven't found a lot of the information that's in this book useful for me. Yet. Like, there are some really cool things in there. There's a load of information regarding handling the meta plot within the current edition, which, as of that book, was Revised Edition, which I don't like because it seems a bit very, oh, we know that Revised Edition was very controversial and people didn't like it, but let us tell you why you should be playing this game this way and how doing things another way is going to be wrong. Which I find a little bit fucking crappy, if I'm being totally honest. It's handled a lot better than that in its writing, it does make some valid points, but the team know that they fucked up, in a sense. They know that people are unhappy, so putting a thing in your handbook telling you that, hey, we really think you should be playing this edition of this game this way, I mean, I get it, but it's just a bit fucking weird. I mean, nobody likes to be told what to do. Yeah, you can read a book and take its themes and ideas and emotions, all the rest of the political stuff that goes with World of Darkness games. You can create like a whole melting pot of ideas to create a very unique version of that game line. But to be told so frequently and to take up so many pages to tell you why you should be doing it this way, I feel is just a wee bit frustrating. I found the bit in this book that talks about philosophy and comparing it to the Greek philosophers and making comparisons to the paradigms or the resonances or whatever it was to Greek philosophers was both very interesting and yet very confusing, which isn't to say that it's bad by any means. Like, I actually get a huge pleasure from listening and talking to people info dump me things that they're completely passionate about, even if I don't understand or have much of an interest in it myself. Like, my partner is really into Friday Nights and Freddy's and Undertale and a few other nerdy things as well, and like, I'm not always going to be into that, you know, as myself for my own interests. But if they start talking about those things, I'm obviously going to be like taking in all that information, because in the case of my partner, I love them and I care about them, and also they're a friend of mine, so I obviously want to hear the things that make them all excited, just so I can understand it a bit better. So even if I didn't really understand a lot of the philosophy stuff, and I'm pointing here because the book is there, I may not understand the philosophy stuff, but it may help me to understand the mindset of mages and their appreciation and dissection of the universe and how their powers and whatnot work. So there's quite a lot of information. It's a very info-dumpy bit, but it's very clear the people that wrote that bit were very passionate about Mage, and I think the passion of Mage is very apparent within this book. There is absolutely zero denial about that. And I found the chapter or portion of the book, because I don't think it was a whole chapter, I don't remember now, talking about the avatars and the seeking, which like the seeking is like the awakening of the mage, where they realise that they're a mage, and their avatar, based on the different paradigms, will put them through some sort of spiritual, metaphysical journey. And it talks a lot about how the different paradigms would orchestrate some of that. Like, some of them are more chaotic, some of them will literally take their soul off to a different plane of existence, some will have them subtly interact with them in the world, and also talks about how to roleplay that. I've mentioned before how me, as somebody who runs and plays Wraith, I saw a bit of similarities between running the avatar for that and the roleplay for the Shadowing Wraith. Obviously without such an antagonistic tone, and obviously the avatar is something that would be directed more from the storyteller rather than another player. But I was able to have a lot more mage flavouring with that, rather than just seeing that and go, okay, I will just make some tweaks and do a shadow equivalent sort of thing, which I wouldn't do, obviously. I would obviously do more research into it, but it's nice to have that source there so I can have a better understanding about how seekings can work within the different mages, and possibly the different editions as well, and to an extent the conventions for the Technocracy, which is all really cool stuff. And despite being a really cool bit at the end of the book, talking about playing for alternate settings and some crossplay ideas, I didn't find that particularly engaging at this time, which isn't to say that I may come back to it and may find it more engaging at a separate time. And I'm a bit disappointed that how it had very little information on the crossplay bit regarding the other splats. There's a lot with vampire and there's a lot of werewolf because they're the big ones outside of Mage, but then talking about the other splats, oh, it has more information about crossplay with Kindred of the fucking East than it does with Wraith and Changeling, and it's basically just sums down to, oh, you've read enough information in this chapter to have an idea about how to incorporate these other splats. Like, fuck off. Like, if you're going to commit to the bit, commit to it properly. Like, even if it's a lesser version of... Don't combine the rest of them into, like, a little paragraph, because it's just a bit fucking wank. I mean, even Holly here is, like, picking up her snoring because she's just outraged by it. I mean, apologies for her snoring. She's just not feeling very well at the moment, as I've mentioned already, and just needs a lot of rest, but wanted to come up, so here we are. Yeah, so... Do I think the Mage Storyteller's Handbook is a good book? Yes. Was it very useful for me? No. Does that mean it's a failure of book to me? No. I'm not entirely convinced that I should have read this at this point in my Mage journey, as it was. I think I've gone from, like, novice to intermediate studying, to be fair. But, you know, the reason why it's here is because I asked for recommendations, and I was given recommendations to this book a lot, so... Here we are. So it is a good book. There's just a lot of information that I don't know how to deal with just yet. There's information on the Marauders and the Nefandi as well, but nothing that I haven't seen already with the previous book. Well, 2 books prior, actually. Book of Madness. A little bit of information on the traditions, a little bit on the Technocracy, but it's all just very general. So... But yeah, I don't really know what else to say at this point, really, which sort of leads us on to the final part of this video, the conclusion. So I think it's fair to say that with this very long video and the part 2 to this Mage the Ascension Appreciation Experiment, that with the books that I've read for part of this, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. There have been some bits that I absolutely loved, there's some bits that I think have been alright, but there's been quite a lot of disappointment as well. And frustratingly, it's within the Onyx Path books I have found most of its frustrations. And most of it has come from the point that treating the adult readers like children. But, as I've said many times already, that's to do with the culture that we have at the moment, where critical thinking is a dying art form, and we have to spoon-feed our readers so they can understand that just because we're talking about bad things does not give you the excuse to be a bad person and abuse the players at your table. Sure, make them feel comfortable because it's on part of the story and it's ultimately a horror game, but to abuse them? No, we don't want that. So, yeah, as I keep saying, I can understand why they keep having to say and be overly apologetic with their offensive material, or at least the offensive material that they're working with, or perhaps problematic would be a better word for it. But then again, problematic is just a lighter shade of offensive. You get what I'm trying to say, I hope. I don't want people to think that, oh, Lord by Night's free of the woke mind virus. Just go fuck yourself. That's not what I'm trying to say. Again, critical thinking here, people. So yeah, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. I have learnt quite a lot more about Mage the Ascension. I have ultimately enjoyed this experience and learning more about Mage. I do like it a bit more now, which is pretty cool, but I think the leap from the first part when we were looking at the core books, like from me not liking it at all to actually really enjoying it, is far greater in the first part than here to liking it a bit more, but at least I'm not liking it less, which is a pretty good thing as well. So what's next? Is there going to be a part 3 to this Mage of the Ascension experiment? Probably. Maybe. I don't really know at the moment, because I bought 2 additional books when I was reading those 5. I bought Lore of the Traditions, so I can have a bit of an understanding of the traditions, because I can't be asked to buy every single tradition book, such as me not buying any of the clan books of Vampire the Masquerade, to be honest. I've had this in a wish list for a while, because when I was wanting to do Mage the Ascension Lore at some point in the future, I put this in a wish list to purchase, and I had a bit more money to buy it, so bought it I did. Now, if I was going to put this in a video, it might be like a chapter by chapter, where each chapter is obviously about the different traditions, and I do, you know, similar to how I've done with these 5 and the previous 4 in the previous video, each part would be dedicated to my thoughts and opinions on the different traditions. That's the idea that I would have at the moment with that one. So if you want that, do let me know in the comments below, and there has to be quite a lot of overwhelming demand for all of that, because I've been reading Mage for just over 2 months now, and I want a bit of a break. So do let me know if that's something that you want, and if you're all really keen about that, that might give me the energy to approach this. And just in case I didn't show you, the back cover looks like that, so it's all pretty cool stuff. Now, the other book I purchased, which you might have worked out already, you might actually already know this, because like this one, I showed this in a social media post, I bought the Book of Secrets, which has the very annoying tagline of an expansive companion for Mage's 20th Anniversary Edition, which is so fucking annoying. Because as I mentioned already, there was so much information that was just sidelined to, for more information on this, go and see this book. So I went ahead and purchased this book, and as I said, I've had it on a PDF that I have flicked through, but it's much easier for me to digest the information in physical form. So if you want me to do a review of this book, do let me know. Again, there's going to be quite a lot of excitement for that, because as I said, bit exhausted with Mage at the moment, and I feel this is just going to be an exceptionally frustrating read, just on the fact that I wasn't able to fully engage with Technocracy Reloaded, because so much of the information was just fucking sidelined here. And Book of the Fallen to an extent, but it's more Technocracy Reloaded that has committed the bigger sin here. But yeah, that's kind of where we're at the moment. I'm slowly engaging and liking Mage the Ascension more. This was a very fun read, albeit a very expensive one. Bit of a mixed bag, as I mentioned already. And if it wasn't apparent, because I know people are going to be asking this, which one was the most enjoyable to read? Which one did you like the most? Well, let's fucking rank them, actually. Let me just hold up the fat cunts without dropping them on the floor. My favourite one, without a shadow of a doubt, is Guide to the Technocracy, then Book of Madness, then Book of the Fallen, then the Storyteller's Handbook, and Technocracy Reloaded, I think, is the order that I'm going to put them in. Which doesn't to say that the one at the bottom is bad by any means, or the one that is like the absolute best book I've ever read. Although I have to say, The Guide to the Technocracy is like one of the final World of Darkness books I think I've read to date. It's just a subjective ranking. I'm sure you're all going to have your different opinions about that. To that end, do let me know what is your favourite Mage the Ascension book out of the ones that I've shown you, or in general, really. Are there any other Mage the Ascension books that you reckon that I might like? How do you want me to approach the 2 books I've just shown you? Separate videos? One altogether? Are there any other Mage books you want me to do in videos like this? Do let me know in the comments below. And at some point I am going to do a how to run the Mage the Ascension video, and also how to run a conventions one as well, which, funny enough, if we're talking about books that have helped me to run and play Mage the Ascension, I feel more equipped to run a Technocracy game than a standard editions one, and I feel that will come after I have read Guide to the Tradition, so I have a bit more of an understanding about how things work. If the structure of like the traditions and their chantries is anything like the Tremere for Vampire the Masquerade, I think I've got some idea about how that works, but I obviously need to do a bit more research about that as well. What books are going to help me to run Mage the Ascension for you lot? Because it's going to be you that I'm going to be running these games for as my guinea pigs, and hopefully we can have a nice fun time with that. So if you can help me by telling me which books I should get, that'd be absolutely fantastic. And a really fun way of supporting that is by going down to the description below, where you can purchase these books that I've mentioned, and these 2 here, which will have special affiliate codes, which means that when you purchase said books, I get some of the money back, so you can financially support the channel, so I'm able to purchase books like these, do reviews like this, and run games for you, because in case you have ignored the title and just saw, oh, Lore's doing more Mage stuff, 110 quid. Quite expensive. These 2 were just over 50. So, I mean, I haven't read them yet, but you can do the quick maths on that. And in total, it has been over 200 quid, which I've mentioned already, but this isn't a cheap endeavour. And if you want me to do videos like this and you want me to run games for you, it would be really great if you can financially support the channel. But if you already have these books, and you have these books, and all the other books down in the description below, plus all my awesome cool homebrew, but you want to support the channel financially still, what you can do is copy and paste the special affiliate code in the description below to the URL of any book on the Strive for RPG, the Storytellers Vault, or any of the other sister sites. Before you add said book into your cart, be it PDF or physical, I get some of the money back that way as well, because I'm affiliated from Drive Through RPG, which is really a cool relationship that we had, because it means that you can get books, I can get books, and you get to have more content like this and allow me to run games for you, which I think is a really cool relationship indeed, as minimal and distanced as it is. But I do understand and appreciate that times are hard on all of us at the moment financially. You know, these are quite a financial burden, I do have to say, but it was a good burden because I was able to enjoy some Mage the Ascension books. So if you can do that and support me financially, that'd be great. If you can't, that's also fine, because as I said, tough on all of us, and it's not going to be any issue to me if you can't. But what you should definitely do regardless is give the video a like, a good old thumbs up, subscribe to the Lore by Night channel, and share this video with any and everyone who would love what I do, and I'll see you on the next upload, whatever that may well be for you. And until next time, farewell. Oh, you have guffed.